After returning from London, Steve Harvey felt a new kind of peace in his heart. The ceremony, the warmth of the royal guards, and the speech from Thomas Reed replayed in his mind like a movie. He carried the golden pin everywhere he went, keeping it in his coat pocket as a reminder of what true purpose felt like. For the first time in a long while, he didn't just feel like a talk show host. He felt like someone who had helped start something that truly mattered. A week later, Steve's show was back on air in Los Angeles. The studio was full and the audience cheered as he walked onto the stage. But something about him seemed different that day. His voice was calm, his tone more heartfelt. When the cameras began to roll, Steve said, "Before we start today, I want to share something personal. I just came back from London where I met some of the most honorable men I've ever known, the Royal Guards. They taught me that kindness is not a small thing. It's the greatest power we have." The audience listened quietly. There was no need for jokes or applause. The truth in his words was enough. Steve continued, "Sometimes we think we have to do something big to change the world. But all it takes is one message, one act, one person who refuses to give up." As the crowd applauded softly, Steve looked down at the golden pin in his hand. It sparkled under the studio lights. He smiled and said, "This little thing right here reminds me that faith travels farther than fame ever could." That episode touched millions of viewers. People began sending in stories about how they had started helping others after hearing about Thomas Reed and Steve's friendship. One man wrote that he began volunteering at a shelter. A young woman said she started calling her grandparents every day just to make them smile. The movement that started with a single letter was now spreading across the world, like gentle ripples in water. One evening, while Steve was reading through some of those messages in his office, Maria walked in holding her tablet. "Steve, you should see this," she said with excitement. The Royal Guard segment just became one of the most watched talk show moments in the world. News channels are talking about it. People are calling it the message that crossed oceans. Steve laughed softly. "That's something I never thought I'd hear. The message that crossed oceans. I like that," Maria smiled. "Thomas Reed called earlier. He said he has something he wants to tell you. He asked if you could call him back." Steve nodded and picked up his phone. Within minutes, Thomas appeared on the screen, smiling brightly. Behind him, Steve could see the palace grounds and a few guards walking in the distance. "Steve," Thomas greeted, "I just wanted to share some good news. The palace approved a new charity program for children of fallen soldiers. They're calling it the Purpose Fund, inspired by your words. The program will help families rebuild their lives and remind them that they still have a purpose." Steve's face lit up. "That's beautiful, Thomas. You're making something lasting out of this message." Thomas shook his head with a kind smile. "We're making it, Steve. Together." The words filled Steve with deep pride. "If you ever need help with that program, count me in," he said. "I was hoping you'd say that," Thomas replied, "because I want you to visit again. Not for a ceremony this time, but to help us launch it." Steve nodded without hesitation. "I'll be there." In the months that followed, plans for the Purpose Fund began to take shape. The Royal Guard collaborated with charities, teachers, and volunteers. Steve used his platform to raise awareness, talking about the program on his show. Every time he mentioned it, people responded with kindness and support. Donations poured in from all over the world. The day finally arrived when Steve was to return to London for the official launch. The palace had set up a large open event in one of its gardens. Children, families, and guards gathered together, surrounded by flags and flowers. The sound of soft music filled the air. When Steve arrived, Thomas greeted him again, this time dressed in a simple navy suit instead of his guard uniform. "Welcome back, my friend," he said warmly. Steve smiled. "Good to see you again, Thomas." "You've been busy changing the world," Thomas laughed. "Not the whole world, just a small part of it." As the ceremony began, Thomas took the stage to speak. He told the audience about how the Purpose Fund was born, from a message of hope spoken on a talk show thousands of miles away. He spoke about Steve's influence and how a few words had become a lifeline for families who had lost loved ones. When Steve's turn came to speak, he walked up slowly, looking at the children seated in the front row. Many of them waved at him with shy smiles. Steve smiled back and said, "You know, when I first met Thomas, I thought I was the one giving advice, but I learned that sometimes, when you give hope to someone else, it comes right back to you even stronger. What started with one man standing guard at a palace gate has now become a message standing guard over hundreds of hearts." The crowd applauded with warmth and respect. After the event, Steve and Thomas walked through the garden together. The sun was setting, painting the sky with soft orange and pink colors. They watched as children played nearby, laughing freely. For a moment, neither of them spoke. They just stood there, taking in the peaceful view. Thomas finally said, "When I first wrote that letter, I didn't expect anything. I only wanted to thank you, but look at what's happened since then." Steve nodded slowly. "That's the beauty of kindness. You never know how far it will go." Thomas smiled and looked up at the fading sky. "You once said that if you're still breathing, you have a purpose. I think we've both found ours." Steve looked at him with gratitude. "Yes, and maybe our purpose now is to remind others of theirs." As night began to fall, small lanterns lit up around the garden. The children and their families gathered to release balloons carrying written wishes into the air. Steve watched as the balloons floated higher and higher until they became tiny dots against the sky. Thomas turned to him and said, "This isn't the end of our journey, Steve. It's only the beginning." Steve smiled. "You're right. Let's keep this going, one heart at a time." When Steve returned to his hotel that night, he sat by the window just as he had on his previous visit. The city lights twinkled below and the golden pin lay on the table beside him. He picked it up, holding it between his fingers. "Purpose," he whispered. "That's what life is all about." He opened his journal and began to write. He wrote about Thomas, the ceremony, the children, and the feeling of connection that stretched beyond borders. His words were simple, but his heart was full. The next morning, before flying back to America, Steve received a small package from Thomas. Inside was a note that read, "For our next step," and a small coin engraved with the words, "Keep the purpose alive." Steve smiled as he tucked the coin into his pocket beside the golden pin. He knew the story was far from over. It had started with one message, grown into friendship, and now turned into a movement of kindness. As his plane lifted off the runway, Steve looked out the window at the city below and said softly, "Let's see how far this purpose can go." The day began like any other on Steve Harvey's talk show. The bright studio lights shimmered across the polished stage, and the audience buzzed with excitement. Steve walked out with his usual wide smile, waving to everyone. His warm laughter filled the air as he greeted the crowd, dressed sharply in a gray suit and bright tie. The show was about to start, and everyone knew that when Steve took the stage, something special always happened. The episode had been planned as a surprise guest special. Each segment would feature someone with an inspiring story. Steve loved doing episodes like that. He enjoyed giving people hope, laughter, and sometimes even tears of joy. What he didn't know was that the final guest that day would touch his heart in a way no one ever had before. The cameras rolled, and Steve welcomed his first few guests. One was a teacher who helped students through difficult times. Another was a firefighter who saved a family trapped in a burning building. Steve listened carefully, cracking jokes at the right moments but also showing deep respect. Between takes, he looked down at his notes and noticed something unusual written beside the last guest's name. It said only, "A royal guard from London has a message for you." Steve raised an eyebrow. "A royal guard? What message could he have for me?" He whispered to his producer. The producer only smiled and said, "Just wait. It's something you'll never forget." The final segment began. The studio lights dimmed slightly and the audience fell silent. The large screen behind Steve showed a video of the Buckingham Palace gates. The narrator's voice explained how royal guards stood for hours without moving, protecting the palace with great discipline. The camera then focused on one man, a guard named Thomas Reed. The audience watched as he stood tall in his red uniform and tall black hat, his face calm and steady. The video ended and Steve turned toward the stage. "Please welcome Royal Guard Thomas Reed," Steve announced. A man in the same red uniform walked onto the stage, his boots polished, his steps firm and proud. The audience clapped loudly. Steve extended his hand with a friendly smile. "Well, I'll be." "You came all the way from London to see me," he said, his voice filled with curiosity. Thomas nodded, shaking Steve's hand firmly. "Yes, sir. It's an honor to be here," Steve laughed lightly. "Man, I don't know what to say. I've never had a royal guard on my show before. I gotta ask, you all never smile? I've seen videos of tourists trying to make you laugh." The audience chuckled and even Thomas smiled slightly. "We're trained not to," he said. "But today I am not here as a guard. I am here as a man who owes you something. The studio grew quiet again. Steve tilted his head, confused. You owe me something? What do you mean? Thomas took a deep breath. A few years ago, I was going through the hardest time of my life, he began. My father had just passed away and I had lost all motivation. I was close to giving up on everything. My job, my goals, even myself. I was stationed outside the palace one day, and after my shift, I sat alone in my room. That night, a video of you appeared on my phone. You were speaking about faith, hard work, and never giving up. I don't know why, but something in your words reached me. You said, if you're still breathing, you have a purpose. That line changed me. Steve's expression softened. He leaned forward, listening carefully. The audience was silent. Every word Thomas spoke carried weight. Thomas continued, his voice steady but emotional. I began to believe again. I pushed myself to stand tall, not only as a guard, but as a man. And last year, when I trained new recruits, I told them the same words you said. If you're still breathing, you have a purpose. Some of those men came from very tough backgrounds, and your message gave them strength. They now serve proudly because of what you taught, even though you never met them. Steve sat back in his chair, his mouth slightly open. His hands rested on his lap, and for a moment he didn't speak. The audience could feel something shift in the room. The light-hearted show had turned into something deeply personal. Thomas then reached into his pocket and pulled out a small folded paper. He handed it to Steve. This is a letter from my fellow guards, he said. They wanted you to know that your words reached across oceans and walls. You inspired people you never knew existed. Steve slowly unfolded the letter. His eyes scanned the words written neatly by several guards. The message spoke of gratitude, courage, and the power of words to lift hearts. As Steve read silently, his lips trembled. He looked up, blinking rapidly, trying to hold back tears. The audience watched quietly. Some people wiped their eyes. The camera zoomed in slightly, capturing Steve's emotional face. He finally looked at Thomas and said in a low, shaky voice, Man, I talk a lot for a living, but right now I don't even know what to say. Thomas smiled gently. You don't have to say anything, sir. We just wanted to thank you, not as fans, but as men who found hope again. Steve stood up and hugged Thomas tightly. The crowd erupted in applause. For a long moment, neither man spoke. It was the kind of silence that carried more meaning than words ever could. When Steve finally stepped back, his eyes were still watery, but he smiled. You know, he said, his voice thick with emotion, I've always believed that God uses people to reach others in ways we don't expect. I just never thought he'd use a talk show host to reach a royal guard. Thomas nodded. He did, and I'll never forget it. The audience gave them a standing ovation. The cameras panned across faces filled with admiration. Steve took a deep breath, wiped his eyes, and turned to the crowd. This right here, he said, pointing toward Thomas, this is why I do what I do. It's not about fame or TV. It's about moments like this. The show ended with Steve thanking his audience and guests, but even after the lights dimmed and the crowd left, Steve sat quietly on the stage for a few moments. He looked down at the letter in his hand again. Every word reminded him that his work had meaning far beyond the studio walls. When Thomas approached to say goodbye, Steve shook his hand again and said softly, You came here with a message, but I think you also gave me something I didn't know I needed. A reminder that what we say can change someone's life. Thomas smiled respectfully. And you changed mine first. As they walked off the stage, the crew stood silently, watching two men from completely different worlds united by one thing, the power of words and the strength of kindness. That night, when Steve went home, he placed the letter on his desk. He read it again before turning off the lights, his heart full. He knew this was not the end of the story, but the beginning of something that would stay with him forever. The next morning, Steve woke up earlier than usual. Sunlight streamed through the window, and he sat quietly at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee in his hand. The letter from the royal guards lay in front of him. The paper was slightly folded from where he had held it the night before. He ran his fingers over the words again, reading each line carefully. Every signature carried a story, and every message was full of gratitude. Steve had done many talk shows over the years, but something about Thomas's message stayed with him. It was more than just a thank you. It was a reminder that his words had a life of their own. He leaned back in his chair and thought deeply. If a message I shared could reach across the ocean, he said softly to himself, maybe it can reach even further. Later that morning, when he arrived at the studio, The crew was already talking about the previous day's show. The producer, Maria, rushed up to him holding her phone. "Steve, you have to see this," she said excitedly. She played a clip from the show where Thomas had given him the letter. It had already gone viral overnight. Millions of people had shared it online. Comments flooded in from around the world, people saying how touched they were by the story, how it gave them hope, and how they were inspired to keep going in their own struggles. Steve smiled softly. "I didn't expect this," he said. Maria grinned. "Well, sometimes the best moments are the ones you don't plan." As the day went on, the phone at the studio rang nonstop. Viewers were calling to thank Steve for the message of hope. A teacher from a small town said she had shown the clip to her students. A soldier from overseas sent a message saying that the story reminded him to stay strong for his family. Even a mother wrote that her teenage son, who had been feeling lost, watched the video and said it made him want to try again. Steve felt a wave of emotion he could hardly describe. It was as if one act of kindness had started to move through countless lives, touching people he would never meet. He decided that he wanted to meet Thomas again, not on camera this time, but as a friend. A few days later, Steve's assistant arranged a video call between them. The screen flickered, and there was Thomas sitting in his modest apartment in London, wearing a simple shirt instead of his red uniform. His face looked more relaxed, and when he smiled, it was genuine. "Mr. Harvey," he greeted warmly. "Just Steve," Harvey said with a laugh. "We're friends now," Thomas chuckled. "All right, Steve, I must admit I didn't expect the world to respond like this." "Me neither," Steve said. "But maybe it's a good thing. People need stories like yours." For a few minutes they spoke about life, family, and purpose. Steve learned that Thomas lived alone but visited his mother often. His father, who had been a soldier before him, had taught him discipline and kindness. Losing him had left a deep mark, but finding meaning through Steve's words had helped him stand tall again. At one point, Steve asked, "Thomas, what made you decide to come all the way here just to tell me that message?" Thomas thought for a moment before answering. "Because I wanted you to know that what you do matters. Sometimes people who help others don't realize how much they've done." I couldn't let that go unsaid. Those words touched Steve deeply. After the call ended, he sat quietly for a long time. He realized that many people in the world felt unseen, even those who spent their lives helping others. That thought gave him an idea for a new show segment. He wanted to create something called The Ripple of Kindness, where people could share how one person's words or actions had changed their life. The following week, Steve announced the new segment on his show. He spoke to the audience with sincerity in his voice. "Last week, a man from London reminded me that kindness travels farther than we think. So from now on, we're going to share stories of how one act of goodness can create a ripple that reaches many hearts." The first episode of the segment featured a nurse who had helped elderly patients during difficult times. The next one was about a bus driver who bought breakfast every day for children who couldn't afford it. Each story was simple but powerful. The audience cried, laughed, and clapped. Every time Steve looked into the camera, he thought of Thomas and his letter. He often kept it in his jacket pocket during the show, like a reminder of why he did what he did. One afternoon, while Steve was reviewing upcoming guests, Maria came in again. "You're not going to believe this," she said, smiling wide. "The Royal Guard you met? He's been invited to speak at a youth conference in London. They want him to share his story about how your message inspired him." Steve's eyes widened. "Really? That's amazing." "Yes," Maria said. "He sent us a thank you note too. He said he'll be talking about how one message of faith can travel across borders." Steve nodded proudly. "That man deserves it. He has a heart that inspires others." A few days later, Steve received a video clip from the event. Thomas stood on a stage in front of hundreds of young people. He spoke calmly and clearly, wearing his Royal Guard uniform. "I once stood for hours at the palace gates, silent and still," he said in the video. "But now I stand before you to tell you that no one should be silent about hope. We all have the power to lift someone else's spirit." When Steve watched that clip, his eyes grew wet again. He whispered, "That's my man right there." That evening, he shared the video on his talk show. "Everyone needs to hear this," he said to his audience. "This is Thomas Reed, a Royal Guard who reminded me that the smallest words can make the biggest difference." The audience clapped as the video played. Afterward, Steve looked around the room, smiling proudly. "This story started with one message," he said. "Now it's inspiring thousands. As the crowd cheered, Steve felt peace in his heart. He had spent years making people laugh, but he realized that sometimes the greatest impact came not from jokes or fame, but from moments of truth and kindness. That night, when the show ended, he walked out of the studio and looked up at the city lights. The sky was calm and a soft breeze brushed against his face. He thought about the letter again, and how it had traveled from the hands of a soldier to a talk show host and now to millions of others. He smiled quietly and said to himself, "That's what life's about, lifting each other up." Back in London, Thomas sat at his desk writing another letter. This time it wasn't a thank you letter, but an invitation. He wanted Steve to come to London for a special ceremony at the palace, where guards from around the world would be honored for acts of service and courage. As Thomas sealed the envelope, he said softly, "It's time I return the kindness." He didn't know it yet, but that letter would lead to another unforgettable moment that would bring Steve across the ocean once more, not as a celebrity, but as a friend who had changed lives with his words. A week after the story of the Royal Guard went viral, Steve Harvey sat in his office surrounded by stacks of letters and emails. Every message carried words of gratitude and inspiration. People from different countries wrote to tell him how the story had changed their outlook on life. Steve smiled as he read a letter from a young man in Kenya who said he had started helping children in his village because of Steve's message about purpose. Another note came from a woman in Canada who said the story had given her hope after she lost her job. Steve leaned back in his chair and sighed with a full heart. He had been in show business for many years, but this moment felt different. The laughter, fame, and success had always mattered, but now he realized that touching lives was what truly gave him joy. He looked up at the framed letter from Thomas Reed, the Royal Guard, that hung on his wall. The words, "If you're still breathing, you have a purpose," seemed to shine more brightly than ever. As he sipped his coffee, his assistant knocked on the door. "Mr. Harvey, there's a special letter for you," she said. Steve took the envelope and noticed the seal of the British Royal Guard. His curiosity grew as he carefully opened it. Inside was a neatly folded paper with elegant handwriting. "Dear Steve Harvey," the letter began, "on behalf of the Royal Guard and the Palace Honor Committee, we are pleased to invite you to London for the Royal Service Ceremony. This event will celebrate individuals who have inspired courage, service, and kindness across borders. Your message has reached the hearts of many, including those who serve in silence. We would be honored if you would attend as a guest of honor." Steve stared at the letter in disbelief. His eyes widened as he read it again to make sure it was real. "They want me to come to London?" he said softly. A smile spread across his face. Now that's something you don't see every day. When he told his production team, everyone clapped. Maria, his producer, said, "Steve, this is incredible. You inspired them, and now they're inviting you to celebrate kindness with them." Steve nodded with a grin. "Well, I guess it's time I take a little trip across the pond." A week later, Steve boarded a plane to London. As he looked out of the window, he thought about how life could surprise a person when they least expected it. He had started with a simple talk show message, and now he was flying to another country because those words had touched a man in uniform. When the plane landed, the cool London air greeted him. The city was alive with the sound of traffic, the sight of red buses, and the charm of old buildings. Steve was escorted to a quiet hotel near Buckingham Palace where he could see the palace gates from his window. The next morning he was scheduled to attend the ceremony. Before going to bed, Steve stood by the window and watched the guards outside the palace. Their movements were steady, their posture perfect. He thought about Thomas and wondered if he was among them. "That man's heart is stronger than his uniform," Steve whispered to himself with a smile. The next morning the city was calm and bright. Steve dressed in a black suit and tie. A palace car arrived to take him to the ceremony. The moment he stepped into the palace grounds, he was amazed. The tall gates, the marble steps, and the royal flags waving in the wind made the scene feel magical. Thomas Reed was waiting at the entrance. He was no longer the silent guard Steve had met on the talk show. He was now standing proudly, greeting guests with a warm smile. When he saw Steve, his face lit up with genuine joy. "Steve," he said, walking forward with open arms. Steve grinned and shook his hand firmly. "Thomas, my man, it's good to see you again." "It's an honor to have you here," Thomas said. "Everyone has been waiting to meet you. The guards still talk about your words every day." As they walked through the palace courtyard, Steve noticed rows of guards standing in formation. Some saluted him respectfully. He felt humbled and a little emotional. These men, known for their discipline and silence, were now smiling because of a message that had started in his studio. The ceremony took place in a large hall decorated with flags and flowers. Guests from different countries sat in the audience. The atmosphere was filled with respect and admiration. When the master of ceremonies began speaking, Steve listened carefully. The man's voice echoed in the grand room. "Today we celebrate those who remind us that courage and kindness know no borders," the speaker said. "We honor the Royal Guard Thomas Reed for his service and the inspiration he shared through a message from Mr. Steve Harvey. This message has touched the hearts of people across the world." The audience clapped warmly. Thomas stepped forward to receive a Medal of Honor. As he turned toward the crowd, he looked directly at Steve and smiled. Then he took the microphone. "Many years ago, I stood at these gates feeling lost," he began. "But one man's words reminded me that life still had purpose. I found strength again, and I promised myself to pass that message to others. Today I thank Steve Harvey not only for his words but for showing the world that kindness and belief can change lives." Steve's eyes filled with tears as the crowd stood to applaud. He tried to stay composed, but the emotion in the room was overwhelming. When Thomas finished his speech, the master of ceremonies invited Steve to say a few words. Steve walked slowly to the stage. He took a deep breath and looked at the crowd. His voice was steady but filled with emotion. "I came here today not as a celebrity or a talk show host," he said. "I came here as a man who learned something powerful from another man's courage. Thomas reminded me that what we say and do can reach places we may never see. Sometimes the smallest act of kindness travels farther than we can imagine." The audience nodded and clapped softly. Steve continued, "I've spent my life talking to people, making them laugh, giving them advice, but today I stand before you learning from you all. You men and women serve your country with strength and discipline, but your hearts carry something even greater: compassion." When he finished, the room erupted in applause. Some guards even wiped their eyes quietly. Thomas stepped forward again and handed Steve a small box. "This is a token of our respect," he said. Inside was a golden pin shaped like a small crown. "It's a symbol of honor, given to friends of the Royal Guard." Steve held the pin carefully, his eyes shining. "Thank you," he said softly. "I'll treasure this." After the ceremony, Thomas took Steve on a short tour around the palace grounds. They walked through the gardens filled with blooming flowers and calm fountains. The two men spoke about life, hope, and how kindness could move across oceans like a wave that never stopped. Before they parted ways, Thomas said, "Steve, you showed me how words can heal. I hope we keep spreading that message together." Steve smiled warmly. "You can count on that." That evening, as Steve sat by his hotel window watching the city lights of London, he thought about everything that had happened. The letter, the invitation, the ceremony. It all felt like a dream. He whispered, "One message started this. Just one." He closed his eyes, knowing that this was not the end of their story. Something in his heart told him that his journey with Thomas and the Royal Guards was just beginning, and that the world still needed more reminders of kindness, courage, and faith. Several months had passed since Steve Harvey returned from London. The Purpose Fund had officially launched, and its impact was growing every single day. Families who had once struggled to rebuild their lives after loss now had hope again. Schools were opening new programs, children were receiving scholarships, and people from different parts of the world were donating to support the cause. Steve followed every update closely. He often spoke about the project on his talk show, sharing stories of people who had been helped. Each time the audience listened with warm hearts. What started as a single letter from a royal guard had now become a wave of goodness that crossed borders and reached countless lives. One quiet morning, Steve sat in his office with a cup of tea in hand. The walls were filled with photos from his visit to London. One of him standing beside Thomas Reed, another of them shaking hands after the ceremony, and a picture of the smiling children who had been part of the Purpose Fund event. He stared at those pictures for a long moment, feeling grateful. Maria, his producer, walked in carrying a folder. "Steve, I just got an update from London," she said. "Thomas has been promoted. He's now leading community outreach for the Royal Guards. He's helping train younger members and organizing programs for soldiers' families." Steve's face lit up with pride. That man was born to lead, he said softly. He took a message and turned it into a movement. Maria nodded. He also sent you a letter. It came this morning. She handed him a cream-colored envelope sealed with the Royal Guard emblem. Steve opened it carefully and began to read. Dear Steve, I hope this letter finds you well. The Purpose Fund has now helped over 200 families, and we have started new centers in smaller towns. Each time we help someone, your words are shared again. If you're still breathing, you have a purpose. Those words are written on the entrance of every new center we open. The people remember you, even here across the ocean. Thank you for believing in this journey. I have one more request. I want you to come back to London once more. This time not for an event, but for something more personal. I'll tell you when you arrive. Your friend Thomas Reed. Steve smiled gently as he read the letter. There was something special about the way Thomas wrote. It carried both strength and kindness. Without wasting time, Steve told Maria, "Book me a flight to London. I think my friend has something important to show me." A few days later, Steve landed once again in the city that had become dear to him. The weather was cool and the skies were clear. Thomas was waiting for him near the palace gates, wearing a simple gray coat. When they met, they greeted each other with a warm handshake and a smile. "It's good to see you again, my friend," Steve said. Thomas nodded. "And it's good to have you back. There's someone I want you to meet." They walked together through the streets of London until they reached a small park not far from the palace. It was peaceful and filled with blooming flowers. Children were playing nearby and benches lined the walkway. In the center of the park stood a tall stone monument. As they approached, Steve noticed an inscription carved into the base. It read, "Dedicated to those who serve in silence and to the voices that inspire hope." Thomas turned to him and said, "This monument was built in honor of the guards who lost their lives while serving. But we also added this section here." He pointed to a smaller plaque below the main inscription. The words made Steve stop in his tracks. It read, "Inspired by the words of Steve Harvey. If you're still breathing, you have a purpose." Steve's eyes filled with tears as he read the words again and again. He looked at Thomas, speechless. "You did this?" he asked softly. Thomas smiled humbly. "Not me alone. The guards did it together. They said your message gave them courage to face each day with pride. We wanted to make sure those words would live on long after we're gone." Steve took a deep breath, overwhelmed with emotion. He stepped closer to the monument and placed his hand gently on the plaque. "I never imagined something I said could end up here," he said quietly. "This means more to me than any award or recognition." Thomas nodded. "You earned it through your heart, not your fame. That's what makes it special." They sat down on a nearby bench, watching the children play in the park. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. Then Thomas said, "Do you remember what you told me the first time we met on your show? You said that God uses people to reach others." "I think that's what happened here," Steve smiled. "You're right. He brought two people from different worlds together for one reason, to remind others that life still has meaning." As they watched, a young boy ran up to the monument with his mother. The boy asked what the words meant, and the mother replied, "It means as long as you're alive, you can do something good in this world." The boy nodded, reading the line again before running off to play. Steve smiled at the sight. "That's it," Steve said quietly. "That's the purpose, bound to pass it forward." Later that day, Thomas took Steve to meet some of the families who had been helped by the Purpose Fund. They visited a small home where a mother and her two daughters welcomed them with smiles. The woman explained how the fund helped her start a small bakery after losing her husband, who had served in the military. "You gave us hope," she told Steve with gratitude. "We found our strength again." Steve shook her hand gently and said, "You're the strong one. I'm just thankful to be part of your story." Every place they visited that day carried stories like that. People who had turned their pain into purpose. By the time evening arrived, Steve felt more fulfilled than ever before. As they walked back toward the palace, Thomas said, "I wanted you to see all this because it started with you. The world can be heavy sometimes, but you reminded us that a little faith can lift even the heaviest hearts." Steve looked at him and said, "And you reminded me that words only have power when someone chooses to live by them." That night, back in his hotel, Steve wrote in his journal again. He wrote about the park, the monument, and the families he had met. He wrote about Thomas, whose courage had turned an ordinary message into a worldwide mission. Before going to bed, Steve stood by the window, looking at the shining lights of London one last time. He placed the coin that said "Keep the Purpose Alive" beside the golden pin on the table. He whispered, "It's alive, Thomas." It truly is. When he returned to America, Steve decided to start a new foundation in partnership with the Purpose Fund. He called it Voices of Purpose. The goal was simple: to help people find meaning through kindness and faith. The foundation grew quickly, with volunteers from different countries joining in. Months later, during one of his shows, Steve shared the story once more. The audience listened closely as he spoke about the Royal Guard, the letter, and the monument. "If you ever think you don't matter," he said to the crowd, "remember that one kind word can reach across the world. One act of faith can light a fire in someone's heart. That's what purpose is all about." The audience stood and applauded. Some were in tears. Steve smiled, looking up toward the studio lights. He knew that somewhere in London, Thomas was probably watching too, smiling just the same. As the applause faded, Steve said softly into the microphone, "To my friend Thomas Reed and everyone who believes in the power of kindness, this message is for you. Keep the purpose alive." The music played and the credits rolled. But in that moment, Steve didn't think about the cameras or the fame. He thought about a soldier standing tall at the gates of a palace, a message written on a letter, and the ripple that grew into an ocean of hope. It was a story that began with a few simple words, but it would never truly end. Because as long as people remembered those words, "If you're still breathing, you have a purpose," the message would live on forever.